This is going to be a hard session for me. Now I'm going to bring up the map. So I'm going to move. So many of you, can you just turn off that got it message on the computer? Oh. Excellent, thank God. So students in the classroom, you have the map in your hands. Those who are in the other classes, you can see the state of where the troop movements are. This was taken as of Friday. I highly recommend that if you want to get daily updates of what's going on the ground there in terms of the actual military engagement, you look at the website from the Institute for the Study of War, understandingwar.org. They post weekly or daily these troop movements. They're also giving analysis from a U.S. military perspective as to what the engagement is from the different, from both Ukraine and from Russia. This morning we heard from Professor Koblenz from George Mason University, and he was talking a lot about the engagement of the issues around the potential use of chemical, biological, and even the idea of using nuclear weapons, which is a very scary prospect right now. But obviously the war efforts have shifted substantially. We are 90 days into this engagement, and Mike Humzinger, who was our last speaker, he opened up and said the thing that is most disturbing to him is he has absolutely no idea how this ends. And that's part of the reason we wanted to engage with you, because obviously this conflict could be going on for a long time. So with that, Richard, are you there? Richard?
I'm here. So I guess we'll just go right to Q&A. And since the professor couldn't join us, and I would like to ask a question of Susan. In my class, we just got done doing both Rwanda and Syria as foreign policy events, and how would one go about after either, whether it's Ukraine, Rwanda, Syria, go about trying or investigating war crimes and then putting them on trial with the ideas of sovereignty and each nation state having its own judicial system? How does that look in an international space? Because I think that's a hard thing for students to understand.
Well, quick answer, there's rules of armed conflict. The United Nations members agree to and sign up to agree to, and the United Nations basically as a body votes to say, hey, this is a war crime, and then we work to investigate that. There's an international court that's set up in The Hague, and so anyone can bring a case to that court. Countries basically bring the case, countries ask for an investigation, so we go in and investigate it. It's done at the UN level. Of course, you have the different levels. With the sovereignty, the country certainly has a right to put their own people on trial if they commit a crime, and then they're tried in their own country. But as far as the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, there was no, I mean, the government had broken down. It really wasn't a government. I mean, the entity and the United Nations agreed because of the tremendous atrocities that there was a war crime that the United Nations members would have investigated, and then they set up a court and agreed that then those crimes, we would get the indictments and they would be tried at an international tribunal. And how does it work, Susan, if we are not, if the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court? We try our own people. Some of the countries try their own people. We have a very serious set of laws that follow the United Nations laws as far as the military, and they are brought, charges are brought forth and they are tried within the military structure, which is a court in itself. It's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. If they violate the same type of war crimes, they're tried
and if found guilty or convicted, and they will be doing time at a place called Leavenworth, Kansas, or Portsmouth Naval Prison. And they will be there for many, many years. Or, you know, if the charges are such, depending on what the specifications of the charges are, then, you know, it could even be death. You know, if it's conduct unbecoming in front of an enemy, and charged, it's the laws, we have the laws and we have the justice system set in place. So, but we want to keep and make sure that no rogue nation tries to try our people, our military, that are there on an assistance mission to pull us into a political situation. Bring the charges to us, we put them through a very public investigation, a very public court system where they are tried and then if found guilty or convicted.
So, questions on that topic from here? So, I'll throw some questions out to you. Why is this war in Ukraine really impactful to you personally right now? What do you think the biggest impact it's having on you?
Besides your $6 gas
Yeah, besides filling up your tank.
and certain foods disappearing out of the shelves of the local Rayleighs down here. And all of you are going off to college, yes.
I feel there's just like, especially just in recent years, now she could be with all the things going on in the world, there's kind of this looming era of non-normalcy and like impending doom. I feel like everyone's been, and I am too, like kind of pessimistic, losing a lot of hope for international politics. And then we're really proud of the community of warfare. And that's what I'm doing the project.
Nuclear warfare.
Yeah.
So for those of you in the other class, Rich, you're shaking your head. So let me repeat what was just said. So why is this war so impactful? You are Maya. So Maya just answered that, you know, part of this is this sense of impending doom, this discussion of the potential that we may be going into a nuclear war, that the world is somehow off kilter, if I can use my words. You know, it just seems like everything is out of balance. And that's been a big issue. I can tell you, I'm a lot older than you, but I have said to my husband on numerous occasions recently, it just feels like everything is sort of out of balance. The nuclear issues, I'm a nuclear physicist by training, and so my background is nuclear proliferation, so you just hit on my background. This is the most serious issue that we in the nuclear community, in the nuclear non-proliferation community, have ever dealt with since, you know, some of the crises, you know, early on, and you've heard about the Cuban Missile Crisis and other things. I monitor and I'm part of the nuclear community blogs and the exchanges that are going on. And I have to say that even though we, in the, you know, the sort of traditional thinking tells us that Putin would not use a nuclear device because the risk of response from the West would be so great. It's probably, watching my colleagues who are still in the business, and I did many years in Washington, D.C. working on nuclear issues, many years in Russia, negotiating nuclear treaties in Russia. This is the most concerned I've seen my colleagues, in that they feel that there has become a discussion that somehow or another the use of a small, what we call tactical nuclear device, is now something that people don't, they don't understand the ramifications of what could happen. And so they're starting to talk about it as if it could be a tool of war that could be used, and we could somehow or another respond. And maybe he sets off a small tactical nuclear weapon in the middle of Ukraine, we don't remember just how devastating that was. And yes, it is very scary that we and Russia developed huge arsenals of nuclear weapons. Some of them were substantial, so we could, test them, and we tested them and used them in cases where they obliterated cities and in some cases obliterated islands. But for me, the hardest thing and the scariest thing in my career was looking at the small devices. These were mortar shells that were nuclear device. So imagine you're out in a battlefield and you've got a mortar and you're aiming at somebody who is just, a few hundred yards away, and you're going to send a nuclear device over there. These small tactical or, use nuclear devices could have been hugely devastating. Now, luckily, during the Cold War, we worked really hard to disarm both ourselves and Russia through a lot of nuclear negotiations. But one of the things that has been disrupted that is very concerning right now in the war is the ongoing discussions with Russia about nuclear disarmament. Those are on hold. They're not dead, but the back channel discussions that we have maintained all through the Cold War, all through some very difficult circumstances, are basically on ice. So we're not talking nuclear disarmament and nuclear treaty issues right now. So please go on.
So, this is kind of a follow-up question, but with regards to, especially with like tactical, do you think that mutually assured destruction would be enough to stop that, or like any kind of diplomacy? Like, what can we do to stop it, or can we do that?
Right. So the question was about the use of the existence of tactical nuclear weapons, and so things like what we used to call mutually assured destruction. Does that apply? Is there a deterrence against using small nuclear devices? The deterrence against using small nuclear devices is a practical one to start with. One is small nuclear devices typically come from a much shorter range. So if you're Russia and you're thinking about launching a small tactical nuclear device into the center of Ukraine, and the center of Ukraine isn't very far from Russia to start with, if the winds shift, if things go wrong, if your targeting doesn't work, you have a very good chance you're going to hit your own people. Okay, so that's the first deterrence about using tactical nuclear weapons. You have to be willing to sacrifice people who are at arm's length from you. Okay, but where we do worry about is the next step. He uses a small tactical nuke in Ukraine, and then how do we, the United States, respond? Well, do we respond in time? Do we target our strategic nuclear weapons to a location, a city somewhere in Russia? And then do we proliferate this exchange? Then you get into the issue of mutual assured destruction. Mutual assured destruction was the fact that we have our nuclear weapons that are on missiles and that could be on bombers or certainly on submarines. They are all targeted, and what we call hold at risk large urban populations in Russia or strategic infrastructure we would want to take out. They're doing the same to us. Takes 30 minutes for us to know, for us to respond, 30 minutes for a strategic nuclear device, an incoming missile to hit the United States. And in that time, we could respond and hold their cities at risk. And then what we would do, we would wipe out each other. So that's where mutually assured destruction comes in. The deterrence factor, though, for small nuclear devices is you may get in your own way. So you had a question?
Yes, so I was wondering, how does that apply to Sweden and Finland with the threats of, the nukes are already close. And they keep threatening to roll near them.
That's a really good point. So with Sweden and let me bring in, and luckily, Dr. Q just joined us. My mistake. While I'm answering that, I'm gonna bring up the map of Europe. So, with Sweden and Finland potentially joining, hold on, Dr. Q. With Sweden and Finland potentially joining NATO, which will likely happen, there's a lot of discussion right now about what the nuclear force structure posture would look like there. Russia is threatening, they could use nuclear, their nuclear posture to threaten, Sweden and Finland, but as you can see, I mean, one of the disadvantages Russia has is they have a long border there, right? So if you get into a nuclear exchange with a country in your backyard, as India and Pakistan have learned, that's really pretty dangerous. But the issue is that when we start to escalate this, does Finland agree to have nuclear forces on their territory? That's still a matter of discussion, even if they do come into NATO. It was a huge discussion when Germany reunited as to whether or not we would put nuclear forces in what was then Eastern Germany, and we did. We have tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. The Russians obviously have a lot. They have a lot. They've always had a lot more, and they already have them here. So what more could they do? We're not sure. What we worry about is this: as the rhetoric starts to ramp up, there's more and more opportunity from the state. More and more opportunity for people to misunderstand what just happened and say, I've got my finger on the trigger and I'm ready to go. One of the things we're really concerned about right now is that the military to military back channels between the United States and Russia are very limited. Secretary Austin just had one of the first conversations he's had with his counterpart in Russia since the war began, and that was this week, and it was very short. And that's what we count on to de-escalate, to check, to make sure. Did you really shoot something at us, or was that a misinformation campaign? So, Dr. Q, you are with us. My apologies. I'm glad you could join us. Would you introduce yourself and just give a little bit of perspective from your end?
Sure. Did you want me to pull up slides, or do you want to pull up slides?
Go ahead and talk, if you would. And if you could turn on your video, it'd be great if the students could see you.
Sorry, I didn't catch that first part. So you do want me to share?
You don't have to use slides, but can you turn on your video? There you are.
Okay, you can see me? I can't tell if you can see me.
So just introduce yourself. We switched speakers, so Susan
Okay.
did the other part, and then I was doing some nuclear fill-in.
Okay. Your audio is a little spotty, so if I can't hear you, you might have to get closer to the microphone. Just to give you a quick heads up on my background, I specialize within medical countermeasures. I am a program officer within the JPEO CBRN, which is the Joint Executive Program Office within the Army for all Chem Bio Rad Nuke. So we do all the nasty bugs in the effort to try to make sure that we have medicines ready, or prophylactics, which are delivered before the actual exposure to any kind of incident in a warfighter setting. Oh, you guys look like you've been having a long day so far. There's so many heads on desks and so many hands resting. So I can tell you that so CBRN, it's an incredibly fascinating subject. If ever you guys end up going into studying Chem Bio Rad or Nuke, we have not been specializing as much in Rad Nuke as we probably should have been. So as your instructor Maureen was saying, having an international power that has nuclear capabilities right next to you and is able to reach you is not something that we've been necessarily preparing for. We've been focusing primarily on bio recently because we just had the COVID pandemic. So all the money has been funneled toward bio. But that said, it's not to discount the rad nuke. Now we have a sustaining program in the rad nuke area, which means that we have available medicines for radiological exposure, but so many of the bio and the chem, which has been threatened to be used within the Russia instigation with Ukraine, we really just don't have kind of reinforcements for that. So it's a high risk in terms of whether we can respond adequately if there were the use of bio or chem weapons. So Maureen, should I share slides and step through them?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Hold on. Okay, now go.
Okay. All right, so you guys can see you guys now?
Mhm.
Great. Okay, so just I go by Dr. Q. It's a lot easier just because I don't want to have my students stumble over my last name, which is kind of a doozy. But I work within the Army. We are their science and technical branch in terms of when things get a little fishy, when there's exposure to something that we don't know what it is, it'll be sent to one of our laboratories for identification as well as any kind of counter response that we want to implore. So disclaimer, opinions here are my own. They're not representative of the U.S. Army or history within the science and technology. I am adjunct faculty. So you're going to hear from a lot of great speakers from George Mason. I specialize within their biotechnology and society, within their biodefense program for their graduate students. I worked as well at Pfizer within their preclinical drug discovery arena, both on Alzheimer's as well as schizophrenia, bipolar, diabetes. And I've recently just transitioned from MITRE, which is a federally funded research and development center operator. You can say that 5 times fast. But they really specialize in doing things that the government can't. So building those industrial partnerships that we really need in order to have a functional biodefense base. I am also a yoga instructor. So that hence I put Honest Soul Yoga on there. I teach there as well as doing my Army job. So you guys have probably seen a lot of this already, but this is kind of the most recent snapshot as of yesterday of Russia's military control within Ukraine. You can see that they're really predominantly focused on the Donbass area. Why did they invade Ukraine? Well, it's probably something as simple as regaining the former glory of the Soviet Union. Maybe there could be something along resources that they wanted to get into Ukraine. Something random that you probably didn't know is that Ukraine makes most of the olive oil that we consume. So olive oil prices might be going up. But expect to see, they expected to go in and be seen as liberators. They thought that by coming into this former USSR, especially where they traditionally speak Russian, that they would be welcomed with open arms and that it wouldn't really be a problem, that they'd be in and out in a couple of days. Turns out they really enjoy being part of Ukraine and maybe not so much Russia. But Russia saw this coming, this adversarial kind of amount of force, because they even started setting up their own internet system, of which they turned on a couple of months, maybe a few months ago. and cut themselves off from the rest of the internet and said that it worked. We can't validate that it actually worked, but that's something to show that kind of Russia is trying to be self-sufficient. They're trying to make it so that there's no dependencies. And that is obviously would be a big component of that. It also hinders our ability to go in and to make any kind of cyber advance if it turns out that they're not connected to the same systems that we're connected to. So what's going to happen next? Well, Russia's focusing on that Donbass area. They really want to secure something for all of this effort and cost and sanctions and expenditures that they've had to endure. But really, they're relying very heavily on these misinformation campaigns, and they're quite rampant. You know that Russia is like keen as far as the bots go. It's something like only within the US, maybe beyond, it's only 12 accounts on social media that broadcast something like 90% of the anti-vaxxer campaign. So it's a very narrowed, small, almost kind of like tactical advance, but those bots, they tend to propagate it, right? They follow those actual accounts, and then they make it seem like it's much more popular an idea than it really is. So regardless of the outcome, you know, Russia is going to message success and triumph to its people. It's not going to say that this was a failure like we are seeing it. They're instead going to spin it and say, you know, actually, we were intending to only take Donbass as is, or something along those lines. So what about what's next? So all eyes right now are on China. Maureen, did you guys speak to them about China at all yet?
Not in this session. So,
Oh, okay. Yeah, so just yesterday, President Biden said that we will take a stronger military action to defend Taiwan against China than we have taken to help Ukraine fight Russia. And that's because Taiwan, well, it's very much a democracy, right? They ended up separating from China. They're pro-free speech, but it's also because Taiwan is an incredibly valuable asset to the rest of the world when it comes to semiconductors and microelectronics. Everything that you contact with every day, your cell phone, your car, your television, all of these include microelectronics that have probably stemmed from Taiwan. If it turned out that China were to overtake Taiwan, it would mean that China would own not just the economic production of all those microelectronics. It meant that they could also turn off the flow of all those microelectronics to the US if ever we came in contact with them. And it also means that they can bug them. So there's been a lot of debate as to whether you should use certain apps, and some of them are predominantly or are actually Chinese owned, which means that the government can supervise anything that happens on those apps. What's the TikTok, I think, is the big one now. If you ever go into the security realm, there's no way you will ever use TikTok. That thing is basically a surveillance system. So when it comes down to it, and you probably don't think that your life is interesting enough to be surveyed, but mine neither. But the semiconductor system is incredibly valuable. So as I said, it plugs into just about everything. And 63% of that is all tied back to Taiwan. And as you can see here in the slide, it's an $85 billion a year enterprise. So why does this matter? What does this have to do with Russia? Well, China is and has been contemplating taking Taiwan for quite some time. And this now they're watching how it's playing out with Russia taking over in Ukraine, or how it's really not panning out how Russia envisioned it. So, you know, would this be something that China would uptake? So lessons learned, as far as what we take away from this, well, Russia definitely did not expect NATO to strengthen because of their attack. They saw NATO as kind of this weakened partnership that didn't have the ties necessary to really amount any kind of response. And yet we have plenty of kind of backdoor trickling of supplies. I have kind of a funny one that you might not have heard of, but last March, so just 2 months ago, Poland decided that they were going to donate their MiG-29 fighter jets. The thing is, they wanted the US to be the one to give them over so that they weren't the ones to give them over. Like basically it's like a hot potato where I want to help you, Ukraine, but I don't want to help you and make it seem like I'm helping you. So they offered then broadcasted actually that they would drop them off and deliver them to the US on their German NATO base. And the US told them, no thanks. Of course, this was with the great generosity that the US would also resupply all the Poland fighter jets with brand new US fighter jets. So we would still have to pay for it either way. But it's essentially something that nobody wanted to touch at the time. Other things to take into consideration is that China and Russia have both been harping about the possibility of biocontainment laboratories, BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs. These are your high containment labs that contain your Ebola, your Lassa, your chikungunya, your hemorrhagic fever viruses, any arenaviruses, bunyaviruses, all of those, which might not make terribly much sense to you now, but just understand that those are the worst of the worst. And we have a system of labs owned by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency that is meant to help survey different viruses popping up around the world, as well as help ameliorate any kind of outbreaks that happen. So there was an outbreak back in 2018, back in India where Nipah outbroke, and it was something like 19 out of the 21 people ended up dying who came in contact with Nipah. It's just such a deadly disease, and it causes swelling of the brain, and you die in a couple of days. But those are the types of things where China and Russia pinpointed those labs and were trying to justify in the public arena that this was the reason why they were invading Ukraine. This was one thing that they mentioned. Of course, the White House saw that for what it was and called them out on it, saying, you know, this is just a misinformation campaign again by these two countries. So zooming in on CBRN, so this is the thing, chem, bio, rad, nuke, they do not care who you are. It's going to take you out one way or another. So Russia didn't necessarily take that into account when they went and invaded into Chernobyl. They ended up digging trenches there, and lo and behold, they got acute radiation sickness and went running for the hills. I mean, it's so poisonous there that the trees have turned red from the actual outbreak of radiation. Really, it's not a good place to be. And so they ended up fleeing the quote unquote red forest. But this does mean that we do need better diagnostic technology to supervise and survey the landscape. And I can talk a little bit more about that if you guys are interested. The other thing we have to make, go ahead.
Sorry.
We only have 5 minutes left, so if you could.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, let me wrap up to say we have also COVID outbreaks that are happening because of the refugee camps, and we need to be able to better control that. I'll leave you guys with one final thought, which is that there's other players still on the field. North Korea just created a video. It kind of looks like a Tom Cruise / Top Gun video of their missiles. So I would definitely highly recommend you guys check that out. It's a strange thing for a government to do, but lo and behold, that is another one of the kind of countries that we're in conflict with. Yep.
Wow.
Oh, I guess this is true. This map, I'm just kind of confused by the map.
I'll have to look at that. I'll get back to you on that. Yeah, that's possible.
And then on the PowerPoint, it says that China and Russia rely heavily on misinformation, but I just think, I thought that it was like maybe the state sponsored disinformation that they were intentionally sending out. So is misinformation, like, are the people spreading it more than the government?
Oh, well, I think that's a really good question. Richard, we just talked about the issue of misinformation and disinformation in the previous session. So you're absolutely right. China and Russia are masters, and as was pointed out in one of the earlier sessions, of disinformation. However, Ukraine seems to be the master right now of pushing out positive information, which may not all be accurate. They have mastered the airways. It's not necessarily disinformation, but they may be not giving all the information that's out there. But the disinformation campaigns that are going on in Russia and China are really what's causing a lot of the population to be sucked in. Although one of the experts that we had talking about China is that China's just going along with the Russian disinformation campaign because that's their way of, being able to say, see, we're not siding with the West. We'll support Russia and repeat your propaganda. But the truth is the Chinese people have much more access to a whole lot of other information than the Russians do right now. And so the disinformation that's coming out of China seems to be just parroting what Russia is saying in that regard. But yeah, so do watch. We had a big discussion in the last session about what are the best sources of information. And one of the recommendations from the previous speaker, if you're not following it, go to the site called War on the Rocks. Fabulous resource.
So my topic is food security and how Russia and Ukraine are some of the biggest oil and wheat producers. How is that going to globally affect the rest of Europe and America?
So the biggest impact to America, to the US right now, is actually an issue impact coming from Russia, which is the decrease in the fertilizer supplies coming out of Russia. That we're feeling already in the Midwest. The world is going to be being impacted right now, particularly those countries like Ethiopia, close to 100% dependent on Ukrainian wheat. So the wheat exports, the wheat harvest was already in Ukraine prior to the war breaking out. Now the challenge is, can Ukraine get it out? And it used to go out through Odessa, and now the port is blocked. And so they're trying to ship them overseas, over land, but that's a big challenge. But the biggest impact to the world is going to be a year from now, because the grain and the wheat is not going in the ground. And so between Russia and Ukraine, you're talking somewhere between 25 and 35% of the wheat supplies for the country. The United States can't pick up that slack, particularly now, because our wheat production is down because of heat and drought and climate change. And Ukraine essentially also produces almost the entire world supply of sunflower oil. So sunflowers, the flour in Ukraine. So those oils are particularly impacted. So with that, go save the world.
See you all tomorrow. Thanks, Dr. Q.
Yeah.